Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to this, third, fourth, something seminar of the programme for this year for the Centre for Higher Adult and Vocational Education Research. This is something of a first for the Centre, if not for the world, because we are streaming the seminar simultaneously to 1 million people across the world. Well, actually, at least one who isn't here, but they will be listening and hopefully hearing and playing a part in the seminar. Secondly, because it will also be recorded and we may be putting it in podcast. Now, this is partly an opportunity for anyone who's here who says, I don't want to be recorded, streamed or anything, to stick their hand up now and or else forever hold your peace. Right, so I take silence as consent, and then I'd just like to introduce Paul Thompson. Paul is, of course, an esteemed colleague. He's also my neighbour, so I know most of his intimate telephone conversations, which are announced at a loud voice through the wall.
And vice versa.
Yes,
of course.
We have offices next door to one another. Paul is on study leave this term, but has been until a few months ago, the director of master's programmes in the school. He's got enormous experience working internationally with master's students, and he's going to tell us today about the role of theory in international practitioner research project. One point I'd like to say that one of the themes that we have really tried to develop two themes in our seminars this year. One is internationalism, and the other is theory. And I'm very pleased that Paul has decided to address both entirely without prompting. You can believe that if you want.
Okay.
Paul, thank you.
So thanks very much, John. And then I suppose the other thing that I ought to say about my own background that's particularly relevant to this seminar is that I came to the School of Education in 2001 after many years in the English classroom, and I came here as a PGCE English lecturer. And you'll see if you look at the handout, and the handout's quite important to the presentation, in the blurb at the beginning, that the Practitioner Research Project, which is referred to in the title of the session, is actually about collaborative approaches to English teaching. So that arises out of my own professional background. And I'm particularly going to be looking at, within the workshop that I'm talking about, there was a particular focus on small group talk for learning, which is a long-standing research interest of mine. And as well as recommending the teaching of reading comprehension through active small group approaches. I'm going to talk you through a paper I'm writing, as John says, while I'm on study leave, on the theme of cultural translation. And I'm going to race through the findings of the Practitioner Research Project, then talk you through the theoretical journey that I've undertaken in trying to frame the findings of that Practitioner Research Project for a journal article, which is still in progress. So I'm really looking forward to any constructive feedback about all of that. As a way of helping me to evaluate the coherence of my arguments. Okay, so welcome to everybody who's just arrived. I'm not going to go through all of that again. Doesn't matter. This was actually the main theoretical question with which I started. How helpful is it to explain the relationships depicted in this photograph as post-colonial? These are some of the 45 Lagos-based secondary English teachers who were involved in the research project as they work in small groups in the British Council premises in Lagos, discussing a series of recommendations about effective English teaching made by me, a white teacher educator representing a British university in the ex-colonising country, talking both about and in the ex-colonial language. So how useful is the work of post-colonialist theories like Homi Bhabha, who I'm going to come back to later on, in explaining these relationships. This is another image which could be regarded as post-colonial. Two white male academics at a graduation event in Lagos last year with around 30 mainly female graduating teachers from one of our two partner organisations in Nigeria. They're actually graduating from our distance learning PGC International course, which was launched nearly 4 years ago now, and we're currently recruiting 230 teachers annually from 8 different countries. And it's significant to say that the course was originally launched in response to approaches from 2 separate groups of Nigerian educators to offer them some kind of distance learning teacher education program in the absence of a high quality local option. When we set up the PGCI course, we decided to include some face-to-face teaching by way of introduction to the online program. So John Wallace and I have now visited Nigeria many times, and the particular research project that I'm talking about today actually arose as a spin-off from the PGCI. As an English teacher, I was approached in 2009 by members of this consortium to run a workshop with a particular focus on the issue of IGCSE English language, where exam performance in Nigeria, according to our partners, is sometimes less than satisfactory. And without a great deal of time to prepare completely new material, I decided in 2009 to deliver similar ideas to those presented during our PGCE English sessions in Nottingham, which are based on active, tried and tested small group approaches, which work very well in our own setting. Once I'd completed this very first version of the workshop, I had a distinct feeling of some very polite but an unspoken scepticism about the viability of some of the recommendations in the Nigerian context. I wanted to get to the bottom of that, and therefore in 2010 set up a piece of cross-cultural practitioner research, which I'm talking about today. And this was driven by the very interesting research question at the bottom of the first column on the slide: what are the problems associated with the recommendation of pedagogical best practice from one national setting to another? So this question was actually relevant both to the English workshop and to the PGCI programme that I've just mentioned. So for version 2 of the workshop in 2010, I replaced a set of 19th century English ghost stories, which had gone down like a lead balloon the previous year, with some passages from Nigerian literature, mainly about the importance of tradition. And this was an obvious but quite important shift from English literature to literature in English. But I think in most other technical respects, the recommendations that I was making in 2010 were the same ones that I'd been making, had been making in 2009, but of course to a completely new audience. So this second version of the workshop was set up as a piece of practitioner research. It took place, as I said, in the British Council premises in Lagos on a hot Saturday in May last year. It lasted for about 8 hours. It was funded by the University of Nottingham Centre for Integrative Learning. And the advertised aim was to give participants a clearer understanding of the learning potential of different qualities of collaborative classroom talk, particularly exploratory talk, as explained by Neil Mercer in his book Words and Minds, and dialogic talk, as explained by Robin Alexander in a book called Towards Dialogic Thinking. And the morning session was based on a series of short video examples from a national strategy DVD of secondary school children between the ages of 11 and 16 talking about literature through use of these different forms of talk. And you can find all the references of the things that I'm alluding to on the final page of the handout, if you're interested. And I contrasted the high quality of learning evident in these extracts, in my opinion, with the poorer quality demonstrated in examples of more transmissive classroom discourse patterns, such as IRF. And on the bottom of the first page on the handout, IRF stands for Initiation, Response, Feedback. I'm not going to go through that example in detail, but arguably a teacher monologue is masquerading there as a classroom dialogue. And my argument was that IRF discourse can inhibit the quality of students' thinking and learning when it's used exclusively, when it's used all the time. It does have occasional value, but it shouldn't be used all the time. So in the light of these various distinctions, the teachers were introduced in the afternoon to the learning potential of a number of collaborative reading comprehension strategies in which both exploratory and dialogic talk could play a part. And you can see details of these again in the handout if you look at the questionnaire that I gave to the teachers on pages 2 and 3. Question 4, for example, refers to an English folk tale, The Pickpocket, which was used to exemplify the learning potential of small group prediction activity. Teachers in pairs then evaluated word deletion or close activity and annotation exercises based on extracts from the novel The Joys of Motherhood by Emma Chater. Hi, there's a handout there. That's referred to in questions 6 and 7. Questions 9 and 10 on page 3 link to the value of sequencing and statement game techniques for the development of reading comprehension, which were exemplified through small group activity around Chinua Achebe's short story Dead Men's Path, and so on. And my central argument throughout this afternoon session was that students' reading abilities are more likely to be developed through active comprehension strategies during which textual meaning is collaboratively interrogated and reconstructed on the basis of students' own questions than through the linear question and answer comprehension format, which is more traditionally used in many English classrooms where questions are framed by the teacher or by the examiner. So this was essentially a social constructivist argument. It was based on the idea that children develop their understanding best through constructing it themselves in an active way, and we can see an example of this in a short video extract. I hope it's going to work, but you'll find the transcript on page 4 in the handout. So we have here a group of 15 to 16-year-old Year 11 pupils in a state secondary school in London, exploring their understanding of quite a demanding poem through small group talk with a teacher sitting on the outside.
I do like this poem because it's like quite dark. It's like not an upbeat poem because it's too free.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, I was trying to make it, but just leave it like that.
It's like quite dark. It's like not an upbeat poem because it's too free flowing.
I think the repetition of the word dark next to in the first stanza at the end, and then the second stanza kind of shows how it's a dull, dark mood. I think. Sorry, go on.
It's like personifying the mirror and the light, but they're both kind of the same thing, but it shows that like different people can see differently.
Do you think it's about getting old? Because near the end it says an Indian old woman. Because I thought it was maybe about a mother and daughter.
No, I thought that was she's drowned a young girl and me an old woman. She spent her youth looking at her like concerned with her her reflection, and then she's all the way to her old age she's been concerned with it.
So I actually played 9 short examples like that to exemplify various arguments about exploratory and dialogic speech. And I have to say that this material has always been very well received by UK-based student teachers. You know, it's the best material that I know of to support the particular arguments that I was trying to make. And I drew attention to the key features of exploratory talk. For example, the visible reasoning in utterances 1 and 9, the joint consideration in utterance 3, the challenge and counter-challenge in 5 and 6. All of these are features explained in Mercer's definition of exploratory talk above. And during the course of the workshop, all the participants were asked to complete the questionnaire that you've already looked at to offer an evaluation for each of these recommended activities. So you can see the questions I asked about exploratory talk, for example, in questions 2 and 3 on page 2 of the handout. I gave the teachers around 5 minutes at the end of each activity to respond to these questions in writing. And then on the following day, a sample of 17 of the teachers in 4 smaller groups volunteered to be interviewed, which enabled me to explore specific areas in greater depth. I'm going to rush through the detail of the questionnaire findings, but they appeared to show that the teachers were overwhelmingly positive about the potential viability of these recommended approaches in the quite privileged private school classrooms where they worked, well-resourced classrooms, class size rarely bigger than 35. So we're definitely not talking here about the state school scenario in Lagos, where class sizes can range from between 50 to 100 and where resources are absolutely minimal. When it came to the interviews, however, I didn't find anything like the same level of support, and I drew the conclusion that the high level of questionnaire support could have been, something to do with my own enthusiasm on the day, maybe. On the evening after the workshop, I read through the questionnaires very quickly, and these are the questions I decided to ask in the interviews. So firstly, is English in your classroom a first or second language? How do you understand the subject English? How willing would you be to allow code switching in your lessons? And on reflection, what are your feelings about the collaborative approaches which were recommended yesterday? So I asked these questions to 4 separate small groups of teachers, 4 or 5 in each group. We talked for about 45 minutes in each case. The interviews were recorded, transcribed by a local Lagos transcriber, because some of the dialect was quite heavy and difficult to follow. And I'm going to give you a very quick summary of the main outcomes. First of all, the question, is English in your classroom a first or a second language? This is really key, because I had been given to understand by our Lagos partners that the English teachers and their students in these private schools were to be considered as mainly first language speakers. Students working towards the IGCSE exam in English language, most going on to university either in Nigeria or overseas. And I'd been assured by the workshop organisers that my recommendations, which I said would be based on first language pedagogy, would be entirely relevant in this setting. However, it turned out in the interviews that there were big differences of opinion on this question. On the one hand, we have Caroline in Group C saying that many of our students are from homes where they speak English right from birth. Many of them cannot even speak their native languages. And on the other, another teacher, Christian, responded to that by saying that while parents may be fond of claiming that their children are first language speakers of English, the reality is that they frequently make errors. And the fact is that English as a first language is beginning to become a bit of a status symbol in this part of the world. This teacher was very clear that Lagos English should be regarded as a second language in the schools in which they were working, and several other teachers agreed. So this big difference of opinion was clearly significant, and the tension that I ought to have been able to bear in mind in the way in which I presented the workshop in the first place. And it was a difference of opinion that clearly influenced responses to the second question, how do you understand the subject English? Whereas my own understanding of oral work in English is based on first language view, learning through talk, informed, as I've said, by theoreticians like Mercer and Alexander. Oral work for many of these teachers appeared to be sometimes more about elocution and pronunciation. So you have a whole segment in the English syllabus on testing orals, consonants, vowels, stress intonation. We use clips from the BBC to model, etc. What emerged from many of the contributions was that English was regarded as the language of the elite, and the primary mission of most of the teachers was to induct their students into that elite, and a command of standard English, as well as pronunciation in received home counties style, would give them the best chance of future success in higher education, in professions, in commerce. English is the elite language. We're trying to speak it in the acceptable form and help our students as well. So I was beginning to understand that my mission and theirs was different. Mine was to construct student understanding through exploratory language, which might involve a form of code switching between non-standard forms as students speak informally in small groups, and then more standard forms when they speak presentationally to the whole class. I want to encourage students to speak with a growing sense of what's appropriate for different audiences, and more vernacular forms of English could well be appropriate for learning in small groups, in my opinion and in the opinion of most other UK-based English teachers. However, in response to the next question, how willing would you be to allow such code switching in your own lessons. This view was clearly rejected by the vast majority of the teachers. Paul said, our English curriculum is exam driven and will not allow use of the vernacular. You know, so it began to dawn on me that if this was their view, that many of the teachers would have been struck by the non-standard ordinariness of my video examples, you know, an example of which you've just seen. The fact that the students represented there were not completely high flyers, the fact that they were a bit rough around the edges, they were frequently not speaking in standard English. You know, this wasn't really compatible with the Nigerian teachers' possibly idealised image of English education. What they actually meant by code switching was between languages rather than registers. So Ekwa in Group B was one of the few of the people that I interviewed who agreed that code switching between languages could be productive. I mean, I won't read that out, but very few other teachers subscribed to Ekwa's view. They said that the school owners and senior school managers would simply not allow any other medium of instruction than standard English. And when I looked at the questionnaire responses later on, I also noticed some reservations that I hadn't picked up before about the fact that my video extracts didn't explicitly indicate any instructional role for the teacher. You know, the teacher is, in the video example that you saw, sitting on the outside rather than being in the centre of the discussion. That, in the opinion of several of the teachers, left too much room for error and misunderstanding. I didn't really see the role of the teacher in the extracts given. A cross-section of unprofessional opinions is hardly a good source of material for learning, etc. So I realised that I was actually a lot more impressed than they were by my video examples of what I saw as skillful London teachers enabling their students to test out new ideas in their own exploratory language, because my initial terms of reference as an English teacher were different. So the emerging theme for me here is to do with cultural translation. What I'd understood from this research process was that my central argument about the learning potential of dialogic and exploratory discourse was in fact a very situated one. It was highly contingent on my own educational circumstances in the UK. That a rigorous process of cultural translation would be needed if the argument was to stand any chance of future success. That within my initial framing of the workshop, several Lagos-related counter-arguments would need to be preempted and addressed. That it wasn't simply a question of replacing English with Nigerian texts, but more fundamentally a question of replacing my London-based video with video of Nigerian teachers, students rather, code switching between different registers, using exploratory and dialogic forms of talk themselves in a productive way, if the case was to be presented persuasively. But I didn't doubt the ultimate translatability of the argument. I didn't really see why any of my social constructive arguments should fall on stony ground. The students in England and Nigeria are all doing the same exam. They'd all be studying in the same English language universities. I regarded my own recommended principles as conducive to exam success based on my own experience as a teacher educator and as a practitioner. But I now kind of began to understand that they would need to be mediated for this particular setting. So now to come to my title, the title of the session about the role of theory in the research project. My starting point in beginning to theorise this material wasn't actually a theoretical starting point, but quite an empirical review article in volume 31 of the International Journal of Educational Development, edited by our very own Simon McGrath. The article was written by Michelle Schweisforth from the University of Birmingham, and it evaluates 72 research studies ranging over 3 decades of the journal's history, and it reports on projects which aim to introduce what's broadly described as learner-centred education into developing country contexts. And I could see my own project falling broadly within that category, especially as more than half of the projects that Michelle reports on are from sub-Saharan Africa. The acronym LCE is used throughout the article to refer to learner-centred education, yet she says that very few of the articles explicitly refer to that term, And she says that in the article, LCE is explained as any basically non-transmissive approach to pedagogy. That's my reading anyway. And her main finding is that the history of the implementation of LCE in different contexts is riddled with stories of failures grand and small. Failures caused by limited resources, by poor teacher training, by the backwash effect of high stakes examinations, in rural settings in developing countries, sometimes by the traditional distance between a teacher and student. But despite these failures, she points out that LCE has been widely regarded over this period as a policy panacea by donor agencies like the World Bank and many other funders from the West, as a medium for social reform in the developing world, potentially helping to address issues like poverty and political authoritarianism. But the general failure of so many similar initiatives over such a time span, she says, raises fundamental questions about how teaching and learning are understood in different contexts, and about whether LCE is ultimately a Western construct inappropriate for application in all societies and classrooms. So that brings us back to my opening question in that first slide about the extent to which this project might be regarded as a post-colonial one. My first response to Schweisfer's formulation is that the notion of LCE is actually too broad, in my opinion, to make the issue of whether it's a Western construct meaningful. For example, you might take Piaget and Vygotsky, both constructivist thinkers, both falling unproblematically into the category of learner-centred education. But theories, their respective theories, imply quite different notions of pedagogy. So you've got Piaget, an individual constructivist. His ideas have been used to recommend that children should learn individually, with the role of the teacher as simply as a facilitator of a rich learning environment within which the child learns. Vygotsky, a social constructivist whose concept of the zone of proximal development has been used to justify whole class teaching and learning, with the teacher in the role of a scaffolding instructor. So completely different views of pedagogy, but both included within the category of LCE, and they could have completely different kind of impact in different settings. So I think that that's problematic. My second point or question about these 72 projects is whether they've all been culturally translated in the way that my own project obviously has needed to be in order to hit the target. I don't think that an LCE intervention would stand much chance of success in the developing world or anywhere else unless it had been culturally translated. And so it seemed to me, from a theoretical point of view, that I could make a valuable contribution to this debate by offering a hypothetical model of cultural translation based on my own English teaching workshop in Lagos. So that's where my theorization of the Practitioner research project begins. So to take this construct of cultural translation, it's definitely an area of growing cross-disciplinary interest in fields such as translation studies, anthropology, theatre studies, sociology. One of the most influential formulations from the field of cultural studies can be found in the final chapter of The Location of Culture by Homi Bhabha, where he uses the term in a figurative way to refer to the process of human migrancy. And he argues that the dominant ideologies of the post-colonial centre have been subverted in the second half of the 20th century by third world migration, expressed in culturally hybrid practices which have undermined the linearities and the hierarchies in the original cultures of Europe and America. And he describes this as a process of decanonization, a displacement of the dominant culture with hybrid forms of identity in what he calls the third space. And in this way he claims that newness enters the world. That's the title of his chapter. And he says that an element of foreignness enters into the initial state of being as migrancy subverts dominant ideologies. This undermines assumptions of cultural supremacy. It empowers the subject. It initiates emancipatory change. So it's a presentation of cultural translation as a mode of being of third world migrancy. representing cultural translation as a universal value, and it's all very, very much part of his mission, which is to move beyond multiculturalism towards a critique of the theory of the uniqueness of cultural identity, which he regards as essentialist and problematic. So this is a very influential post-colonial view of the idea of cultural translation, which you can't avoid if you want to discuss the topic, as I do, but which I wouldn't personally wish to adopt, and I'll explain why. In the first place, I think that Baba doesn't seem to be talking here about translation as I understand it, and maybe the term cultural decanonization would be a better way of putting what he's talking about. But I also think more generally that there's a tricky metaphorical threshold between interlingual and cultural translation, which he sometimes confuses. To translate culturally isn't at all the same thing as to translate from one language to another, although there are obviously links between the two processes. But we must always remember that the idea of cultural translation is a metaphor which is not specifically bound to language. And this point is very well made in an interesting paper about the translation writings of Gramsci, the Italian Marxist, by an Austrian academic called Birgit Wagner, who argues that although Gramsci's notion of translatability isn't quite synonymous with the term cultural translation, it's very close. Her paper's entitled Cultural Translation, a Value or a Tool. Let's start with Gramsci, which kind of speaks for itself. And she explains that Gramsci's notion of translatability in the prison notebooks is closely linked to the challenge for communists of his era to communicate with people who don't share the theoretical preconceptions of their political leaders. And his writing about translatability includes a story about a memory in prison of a criticism made by Lenin about the final resolution of the Third International Congress of Communists in Moscow in 1921, that the question of cultural translation had been neglected. Lenin said the resolution had been written according to the conventions and terminologies of Russian Soviet thinking, and consequently stood very little chance of being understood by working class people in other countries who didn't share this particular mentality. And this example reminds Gramsci, who was himself a bilingual Sardinian and felt these issues very keenly, that translatability is politically necessary, that it must involve empathy, which is called in Italian compassionata, or an attitude of compassion in the sharing of feelings. So he said that political translators need to listen with care and passion in order to transcend the tendency of a dominant party or class to universalize its categories. And Wagner, in her article, concludes with this statement that you see in italics at the bottom of the slide, which I think is pertinent to my own project. Let us put it in other terms: a person or a political entity who doesn't take into account the translatability of discourse will not be able to achieve political goals. So she's implying that cultural translation should be part of a dialogue that respects addressees not merely as listeners, but also as active agents who have something valuable of their own to say. So this definitely resonates with what I'm trying to do with my own material, and I'm inclined, as I say, to want to promote Gramsci's more political version of cultural translation, Gramsci on the left, as an instrument of practice, with, on the other hand, rather than Baba's more postmodern image as a state of hybrid migrant being. Gramsci's aim in his writing about translatability was less to try to develop universal values and more to try to bridge the gap from the universal to the local, in, say, trying to culturally translate the discourse of dialectics or political economy from one setting to another. And he said this should involve cultural reinterpretation based on analysis of the structure of the social relations of production which underpin the source text. And in the handout on page 5, you will find a simplified model in figure 1 of the translation steps, according to Gramsci, which are necessary between two different natural languages. This comes from an article by Derek Boothman about Gramsci's translation writings. And you'll see from the direction of the arrows that Gramsci doesn't think it's possible to translate words horizontally, directly from natural language 1 to 2, because he believes that the task of translation will always be mediated by structural aspects of the source text and structural aspects of the language into which that text is being translated. So he says that the translator's first task is to link features of the surface linguistic level to its underlying social relations of production, and then to relate those underlying relations to the social relations of production underpinning the language into which the translation takes place. According to this model, translatability is possible where the structures at the base of different languages bear similarities to each other. So where societies are at an equivalent level of development, similar ideas can be much more easily manifested in their respective languages. But the challenge for me is a slightly different one, obviously, because our natural languages in the workshop were broadly similar, notwithstanding some differences in dialect. The issue for us in the workshop was more about our respective social languages. So I'm taking the idea of social language from the cultural theorist Bakhtin, who in his book The Dialogic Imagination, he finds a social language as a discourse peculiar to a specific stratum of society, professional, age group, etc., within a given social system at a given time. So according to Bakhtin, any stratum of society will have its own distinctive social languages, so the young, the old, professional communities like lawyers, doctors and English teachers. So I would say that I had formulated my text in one social language for the student teachers in Nottingham. I now needed to translate it into a different social language if it was to convince 45 secondary teachers in Lagos. And I was beginning to understand my research project as part of the process of learning the key features of that social language. And I thought that I'd try to adapt the Gramscian model in figure 2 on page 5 as a way of trying to generalise what this process of cultural translation meant for me. And as I've already said, it's certainly a big figurative leap from a natural language to a social language, so I'll need to discuss that further and write about that and justify it more in the article. But the arrows in the second diagram look in two directions at once in order to express contradiction, to reflect the fact that this is intended as a dialectical model which works to the unity and conflict of contending opposites. The culturally translated workshop would be the culminating synthesis of the contradiction between the original source text and the audience reception. And I think that I'd want to see the process holistically rather than something taken one step at a time. So the process in figure 2 is basically about the following activities. First of all, looking very carefully at the source text in order to understand the social relations within which it originated. Then making a clear distinction between principles which are contingent on local circumstances and those essential principles which could be relevant to the social relations of production in the new setting. Then making a creative effort to translate the text into terms of local contingency, for example, through examples which relate to professional language in the local settings or through revised arguments which directly address local concerns. And then culturally restructuring the source text in a way which relates to the social language of a new professional audience. Obviously, as an outsider, you can't speak that social language, but you can relate to it if you understand its basic terms of reference. So I would start to prepare the ground for cultural translation here by making a clear contrast between the social relations which underpin the source text and its intended cultural translation. I'd contrast the way in which the intention of the source workshop was to support the induction of new student teachers by University of Nottingham staff into the academic discourse of the English teaching community in the UK, more broadly into some of the practices of English state education. I'd look at the power relations within all of that, the fact that the tutors will expect to see some evidence of experimentation with some of these techniques if they're to be successful, during their lesson observations, And then by contrast, I'd consider that the Nigerian teachers work for owners and managers of private schools who, unlike the tutors of these students, don't necessarily judge small group talk to be educationally productive. I'd think about the fact that their primary mission, as I said earlier, is to educate an elite in standard English to secure access to higher education, both overseas and within Nigeria. And then moving on to the second bullet on the slide, about the essential as opposed to the contingent workshop messages. For me, the core message would be about school students being encouraged to actively engage with narrative texts through collaborative exploration arising from their own questions rather than from the teachers. I distinguish the impact of this key message for trainees in the UK who have a more experimental and exploratory remit, with the impact for established teachers in Lagos who are highly accountable to school owners and to parents who are paying the fees to achieve exam success in the particular UK-based syllabuses they're using. So through my practitioner research, I would argue that I now have a much more nuanced grasp of the key terms in the professional language of this target group. I can construct careful arguments which are much more pertinent in the addressing of their local concerns and issues. You know, I'll write more about that in the article. But just to finish by tying up the various strands of my argument, first of all, in response to Schweisforth's review findings about the almost universal failure of 72 learner-centred education initiatives reported in the International Journal of Education Development over the past 3 decades, I would repeat that a rigorous process of cultural translation before projects begin could maximise the chance of greater levels of success in the future. That would be the key argument, which I'm testing out on you, of course. On the question of the usefulness of post-colonial theory, I don't personally see great value in regarding the workshop in any sense as a cultural act of violence on these Nigerian teachers as part of a one-way process of domination. For me, the process of cultural translation is very much a dialectical process which ought to work beneficially in either direction as a technical instrument rather than a vehicle for post-colonial oppression. And we might be talking about a workshop delivered by Nigerian teachers on the importance of respect for tradition, for example, for teachers in the UK. The same principles would apply. I'm simply arguing that in order to transfer successfully to any new national setting, recommended pedagogies need first of all to be evaluated in terms of cultural contingencies which arise out of the underpinning social relations of production. That's what I'm trying to get at in the model. And again, that's very arguable, so I'll be very interested in what you say about that. And then finally, I also just wanted to say something about the title of the seminar, the role of theory in helping to plan, implement, reflect on practitioner research. My only theoretical consideration at the start of the project was around the question I've just discussed about the usefulness of post-colonial theorising. The theme of cultural translation emerged independently out of the process of data analysis. I read a great deal of literature in various fields, quite a lot I haven't told you about, particularly from the field of anthropology, which I would include in the article. But I hope that I've in that way managed to avoid any tendency for theory to over-determine the analysis of findings, which can be a problem where projects are set up specifically to justify particular theoretical positions. The direction of this project was driven empirically in response to a practical research question: how does this so-called this recommended so-called best practice look in the Nigerian setting? And I didn't allow the project to be dictated by any grand narrative, even though, you know, I finally do come down in favour of a Marxist rather than a postmodernist view of cultural translation. That wasn't predetermined. And in fact, my first draft of the paper did actually attempt to theorise the concept in Barbar's terms. And it was only when that led to a dead end that I became more critical of his position, turned to Gramsci, other writings within a realist rather than within a postmodern tradition. So what I can say about theory by way of coming to a close is that it's helped me to see links, to ask significant questions about the data, to connect my findings with those of others in various fields, hopefully therefore to be able to generalise in such a way that I could add something new and useful to this area of debate. So whether I've been successful in that, I will now be able to judge on the basis of your feedback.
Thank you very much, Paul. That was fascinating. At this point, I'm going to throw it open to all those here to contribute. We might just get some contributions from afar, and if so, I shall feed them into the general discussion. Simon.
A couple of things. Firstly, I really enjoyed it. I suppose if on the post-colonial I was thinking of a different strand there, and I'm thinking of people, say like Ngugi, some of the African writers who are talking about, in a sense, how we've colonised ourselves or become colonised in Africa and therefore unable to get out of it. So I was thinking, at one point when you're describing Baba and the decanonisation, that's kind of happened in London, but it's not happened in Lagos, arguably. That there's, for economic as well as cultural reasons, keeping the standards are very important, even if the standards no longer are the standards of the metropole. So there's that kind of strand of the kind of thinking about colonial and post-colonial relations, that there's an importance in holding on to standards in the periphery even when they've gone in the core. My second thing is, if I was, going back to Michelle's work, and I suppose thinking with a journal editor hat on, what of course is different about your paper from the cases that she's referring, well, two things strike me. Most of what she's looking at, of course, are big, they're big, they're aid projects, they're public schools. So there's three elements of their story which are not your story, and I suppose it's the twist of the paper that allows you to say, but it's also, it's not that this is an example that can't talk to that because it's a different setting, but it still talks back to it, because I suppose that allows, by being smaller scale, by being more equal in the sense that it's, let me call it a commercial relationship, but it's, it's a different type of relationship. It's not an aid relationship, and it's private. That maybe opens up a dialogic space that, although the aid projects will always talk of that dialogic space, they find it hard to deliver.
I think some of the studies in her article are small scale, but I agree that a lot of them are much bigger than the one that I've undertaken. But I think that, this is arguable. I think that the conclusions I could draw from this little project in Lagos, which is just is really just a practitioner research project, could hopefully talk, as you say, to those projects.
I think it does.
Would there be, does anybody else feel that there could be any problems in that dialogue? I can't think of any.
No.
I'm just asking as a matter of interest. But then the first question, it was, quite a challenging one, really. I suppose, what you were explaining there could be compatible with a Gramscian
I think it could
political position. I think I'm really playing the devil's advocate in saying that post-colonial theory is completely irrelevant to this setting, because if you look at those two images at the start of the presentation, that clearly doesn't hold water. There is something post-colonial about that relationship. I think at the end of the day, what I'm saying is that the notion of cultural translation, however, nevertheless, is something which could be regarded as technical, purely technical, two-way. It could work between any cultures. It doesn't have to be located in a post-colonial context. But again, I'm not completely certain about that. So I kind of presented the question in a provocative way, and thanks for coming back constructively. I'll look at that again.
I was thinking along perhaps somewhat different lines when you were talking. I too found that incredibly interesting, partly because it introduced me to some stuff that I wasn't familiar with. So excuse me for not being as up on some of that reading as I might be.
I've been on study leave.
But what I was thinking about was perhaps the nature of risk in the educational enterprise, and how individuals, including, importantly, classroom teachers, perceive risk, and how that connects with ideas of authority and of authenticity. That's an observation, not a question, but it was just the way my thinking.
So the teachers in Lagos would be less inclined to take risks than the student teachers in Nottingham, who are encouraged to take risks. Is that what you mean? Is that the kind of
it's partly that kind of context, but also their because of the nature of their contracts in the kinds of schools in which they work, they may, of necessity really, be risk averse.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, that's one of the things that they were explaining over and over again. That it was very difficult to, that you have to bear in mind that school owners wouldn't necessarily see, group work in a classroom as being educationally productive. Even though a lot of the teachers actually did use a lot of these techniques already, I have to say. I've because I had a short period of time to summarise my findings, I've probably caricatured the outcomes a bit.
I also thought about sort of practicalities, like for instance the little bit of video that you showed, that clip of that class discussion from London. I noticed that the desks were in a kind of a sort of arrangement whereby the student participants could to some degree see one another. And if you're used to a classroom or forced to teach in a classroom where everything's in rows and people can only see the backs of one another's heads, it's a rather different, so there are even quite sort of banal physical factors like that might bear on it. So I was just kind of trying to identify really with the comments that you showed us from the Nigerian teachers and think my way into some of the difficulties that they might have in
I mean, I was really quite shocked to discover through this research project that they had seen my video examples, which I thought really were the best examples I'd ever found of this kind of talk. For student teachers in Nottingham, and I'm sure that they have a similar view of that. They've always been very enthusiastic about that material, to find that it just wasn't seen in the same way. So that was good. That was very revealing.
Yeah, that's why I mentioned perceptions of authenticity and the relationship with the notions of authority.
I can see if you put that video into the Chinese English teaching context, you will have a very similar objections from the classroom teacher. First, I agree with Tony. We have a much bigger student size. Like people were sitting one row and another, so it's very rare for us to have a small group discussion environment to allow students to just talk to each other, challenging each others. And also, I think I agree. Like, I hope I'm wrong now, but I think when I was educated, like learning English in China, we don't actually give many opportunities to speak out or to challenge something. We have to stick with, the textbook, pronounce exactly the same pronunciation. So I just feel the whole project is quite fascinating. Two questions. I don't think you have to give me an answer, but just actually I'm thinking in my mind as well. Do you see any tension between cultural translations and cultural identity? For me, it's like how much really do we need to translate and how much do we need to keep? In China, Chinese philosophy, we think about the balance theory. Means like balance is very important, yin and yang. But always, I think I find the tension about, again, coming to England or going back to China, how much do I need to adapt myself and how much should I need to keep? Even for myself, I think it's quite a big question. And secondly, I think the context for your project is for English as a first language learner.
Well, again, there was that was unclear.
Yeah.
I'd been told, this is first language stuff. Your recommendations will be fine, but it transpired that there was a view that we were talking about second language education.
If you go to a context, definitely English as a second language, will you have the same conclusions in terms of cultural translation, or you have a different point of view? I don't know.
So what you're saying is that maybe to a certain extent you should just let the material speak for itself, and if it doesn't, then you can draw the conclusion that it wasn't relevant to them anyway. Is that what you would say?
That is your interpretation.
I'm sorry.
I'm actually not really sure myself, but just again, I think it's not really my field, but I find it interesting.
But so is social constructivism a Western construct? Arose in this country, say probably in the 60s, certainly in the area of oral speech word I'm talking about, under certain historical and social circumstances. My assumption when I went to Lagos to talk about how to get these students to do better in our GCSE exams was that it would just work. I just couldn't. I was really surprised that it just didn't kind of hit the target. To begin with, I couldn't really understand why it wasn't working, because it always works with our students, and it represents, my own conclusions about good practice over many years. But there is the argument that it may not be relevant. It's a Western project. It's something to do with, the ambitions of the World Bank in sub-Saharan Africa. Maybe we should pull back from this kind of approach altogether. Maybe, if the Nigerian educators are interested in coming to the UK, finding something which they think is interesting and relevant, they can take that back to Nigeria. But in the meantime, we should just mind our own business and concentrate on more parochial concern. Although, in the first place, I was invited to go. The PGCI programme that I talked about at the beginning was something which we developed because we were approached, and not because we wanted to, colonialise Lagos education or anything like that. So it's difficult to kind of make your mind up.
No, I was thinking kind of in the same line, because how old are the students? Say 16?
They were 11. The students that these teachers were teaching are 11 to 16 in age, and then a lot of them would come up to the UK to do A levels over here.
Okay, I was thinking in another kind of in another sphere, but there's an author called Michel Bonvin. I don't speak French, and he talks about the capability for voice. And when I was looking at the video, it was kind of like the goal that the students will engage, they will enhance their capability to speak in public without shame, and they will engage in discussion. But for having that capability, first they should have the functioning, they should have to have the tools to know how to do and to be a speaker. And maybe I was thinking also, like with 11, it's so cultural. It will be so much discussed if a kid, if it's a kid or it's not a kid with 16. It will depend in a lot of context. And then if that person has not given the tools to speak without shame, to reason, and to evolve an argument out of the sphere of the school, at home, in the political sphere, in the clubs. So it is difficult that then you say, okay, like a teacher position out and say, okay, discuss. I never did before. I didn't know where to start. So I think that discussion is an art. It has to be work, and in every country, because every society has the cultures and the scenes, so it is different. So I see they are like a clash.
Between the universalizability on the one hand.
Yes, like it should be. I think it is very difficult to make it. I think it's quite normal that for some, in some places, will be received with skepticism. That video, because they will think, okay, they are just kids. Some other people will think, no, they are already adults. They have to engage. They have to exercise that capability.
So all I'm really saying is, if there is skepticism, then one thing that you could do is to think more carefully about the way in which the project's received, reformulate it in a different way. It's a question of whether.
So that was, I think then the diagram and all that is for me really telling that I see theory moving, and I was also fascinated about that. Like you have to take the socioeconomic context. I think it is really important before you engage.
Great.
At this point, Paul, I want to feed in a comment which has come from Jill Johnson in some distant part of the world. She comments that maybe evolving towards change is usually difficult, and do some pedagogical steps sometimes need to be more gradual in any cultural context.
Yeah, I'm sure they do. I'm in thinking to the Schweisforth article and some of the projects that she describes in rural Africa. The idea of introducing fully fledged social constructivism into a rural classroom. it isn't going to work. It isn't going to work, and I can see that there are a couple of examples given by Michelle Schweisford in that article of where, instead of talking about learner-centered education, the researcher or the person who was running the intervention began to talk about learning-centered education instead, and the more contingent constructivism, where these projects are adapted for a longer-term impact. But my argument would be that in this particular setting, the classrooms in Lagos, on the face of it, wouldn't appear to be that much different from classrooms in England. The class sizes were similar, so you can't say that the approaches wouldn't work because of class size. The students were of a high standard. They did speak English very well. They were doing GCSE exams, so that's my answer, Jill, somewhere out there.
I just want to say one thing, coming from a colonial background, and we were doing the same GC. Just coming here and studying, I would say how easy would it have been if we could have had that same setting, talking about all these poems composed on Westminster's Bridge, sitting in the sun and all these things. It doesn't have any context to us, but we have to learn it. You come up here now and you see the autumn and everything comes so real. It's realistic. And that is what they do every time. You see the material you're sending out does not hold the context or the cultural aspect that should be done for students in that particular environment. It's the same thing. Robin Sevenbergen came up a week and she was talking about the Aborigines in Australia. I mean, you can't just go in and impose and say you're talking in the language and it's English. That's not their common tongue. And we're imposing upon them and then they must learn that. That's the same thing with us in Antigua. And they will be saying things like, oh, you're not allowed to talk dialect in this. And that's the language the students know. That's what they're going to be communicating in. The examples we get all the time, they're English examples. They have absolutely no meaning to these children. So anytime, even if you're going to be explaining something, is really translating and saying, where is the parallel in their context? And that is what we need.
So, okay, I'll go off as a slight tangent and say, when approached by educators in Lagos to do some work with the students with the teachers actually, on GCSE English, I could have said, well, no, I don't think that's relevant. What do you think? How should I have reacted?
No, what did they get out of the project? That was the whole question that would always have to come in. Because you're in a funny position because they're just coming and saying, please come and explain to us. And you should be asking in what context? What are the sort of things that we're looking for? What's the composition?
So I think that's probably the conclusion that I've drawn. In order to be able to do that, you have to do an awful lot of work to begin to see the issues in their terms.
Yeah.
And it might be, I don't know, might not be worthwhile.
No, it could be, but what I'm saying, every time as these project managers coming in to say, like a Caribbean country, or like, okay, you're into Africa, is always saying, what am I going to be using in terms of components to get across what the English exam is actually trying to tell them? What can we say that we can say align to what the things are? And let it become more relevant.
So you are recommending a process of cultural translation?
Yes, I'm for that.
Now this isn't a criticism of your project, but it's a reflection, starting with referring to Michelle's paper. And it seems to me that part of the difference here is about things of scale and scope. So as you said earlier, some of these projects, like the project to reform the curriculum in Benin next door, is about the World Bank and USAID trying to democratise the country, and learner-centeredness becomes one of the tools that's going to democratise a country. That's a big thing to impose on an approach to learning. And then, of course, it's a big, multi-million-dollar project with project cycles and disbursements and targets, etc. And it takes an international best practice, which may be a genuine best practice in, say, Nottinghamshire schools, but it kind of mystifies it into this international best practice, sticks it in a multi-million dollar project, and with a political agenda behind it. Mm-hmm. What hope has it got, as opposed to something that's small, can be contingent, can actually be genuinely a learning project. So I think, you know, the
No, I
real
agree.
possibilities
I
in what you're
completely
doing.
agree.
I think some of those, and that's part of the problem, is they think they can do things that way, but they don't work, would be my thesis. You know, international best practices are almost doomed to fail. I think they are doomed to fail because they're infested with all these things that are a way of seeing the world that actually doesn't work, whereas what potentially does work is some kind of learning process that's about translation, about some hermeneutic moment. But, you know, that's not the way that, you know, the state, the global infrastructure sees the way of doing it.
No, that's
Yeah.
great. That's a really good way of putting it. Yeah.
Could I have a go? I mean, about Gramsci. I mean, many years ago, I spent an awful lot of time reading Gramsci, and my copy of the prison notebook has got it underlined all over the place. But what surprised me was not that you found him talking about culture or translations and that sort of thing, but that you saw this as less political and more technical than the stuff that you got out of post-colonial literature.
No, actually, I think if I said that wasn't quite what I think. I mean, I do think it's political. Yeah, it's politically important, but it's a technical project. If you see what I mean. Anyway, sorry. Carry on.
Maybe then it's where I go from that, because I wonder whether, you know, the model that you, or the image that you produce, and maybe that Bootman and whoever give of Gramsci's understanding of culture is a sort of unitary one, isn't it? So you get into a context and you can kind of, through a technical process, completely understand it, and then you can kind of translate it over. Maybe I'm misunderstanding the tables.
Yeah, I think this is very schematic.
Translate it over. Whereas my recollection of Gramsci is of the complexity of his argument about things like language and so on, the complexity of his concepts of things like common sense, his notion that people have contradictory consciousnesses which are operating within them all, you know, simultaneously, and that as a person one operates with those different contradictory consciousnesses at the same time. And I just wonder how that plays into a story about which all I know is what you've told me.
Well, I think that would be entirely compatible with what's being said by Gramsci about translatability and cultural translation. I mean, he's really talking about the translation of paradigmatic discourses, you know, like English political economy or French political thought, into each other. He's saying that if there are common factors within the social relations of production at the base of societies, it's possible to express particular discourses from one language in another, but you have to go through a process of understanding what those social relations might be. You can't just translate directly, horizontally, from one natural language into another. So I think what you were saying about Gramsci there is entirely compatible with... He doesn't really write much about translation, you know, it's just a few pages in the prison notebooks, but, you know, it just struck me after reading Baba for some time that this was much clearer, and the political dimension did appeal to me, you know, the fact that it was about communicating complex ideas from one national setting to another. I thought that made a lot more sense than seeing cultural translation as this universal condition of human migrancy, which is very useful if you want to theorize about literature and history and culture, but, you know, it didn't just really work in terms of the way in which I wanted to understand cultural translation. So I ended up in that position.
Further contributions? If not, I will wrap it up with one or two. Well, firstly, a really warm thank you to Paul, who's given, I think, a really fascinating presentation. I mean, really, both at the level of research and at the level of how you work through theory into that. I think that was really interesting. Secondly, to say that I'm a bit scared about it because the next seminar in our series is by me on the 18th of January, when I'm going to be doing something which unfortunately I called "What Does Theory Explain About the European Union's Lifelong Learning Policies?" It seemed like a good idea at the time, but I'm not convinced that the European Union will exist by the time
We just changed it to did.
the seminar takes place. That's on the 18th of January, and I do hope you can join us there. And thank you very much for this. And thank you very much, Jill, for being the first international distant participant in our session. Thank you very much.